Okay, welcome back. So I'm now going to be presenting on the Programmable Communications Review. Again, thank you to our sponsors for making this possible. Automat, Ava Network, GoContact, BroadVoice, Strolid, Radisys, and Telnix. So I'm going to be dividing this presentation up into three sections, three videos. So you don't have to listen to me for too long. So I'm going to be covering landscape, market sizing, and growth. If you've seen a presentation, my review from last year, it's going to be similar, just a few minor updates. So you can skip it if you want. Same with the trends and strategies. Again, just a few updates. Most of the new stuff and the interesting stuff is going to be in the 2020-2021 review, because I also look at going forward as well, what it all means. And these are going to be three separate videos. So let's get down to landscape, market sizing, and growth. So the model I use for programmable communications is we have the enabling software and platforms and critically open source projects. Really, programmable communications was built on open source, even with Twilio. I mean, granted, they've raised so much money that they're able to build virtually all their own technology for application servers, but still, they began on Asterisk and then moved over onto FreeSwitch. And then built on top of this is in-app communications like Agora, CPaaS, many different CPaaS providers out there. I'm going to show a few examples in the next slide. Twilio is so much more than a CPaaS. Business messaging. So this is where you include some of the business processes, some of the marketing stuff, automation technologies, whether it's bots, speech rec, workflow, knowledge management, conversation interfaces, and of course, all the marketing automation tools across omnichannel, email, SMS, and all the messaging variants. And then the two major divisions of enterprise communications, that is employee communications, unified communications, or just basic business telephony. A lot of companies don't want UC, they just want a phone system that works and works reliably. And also customer communications, contact center, etc. And of course, we've seen some merging between employee and customer communications. In fact, our sponsors, BroadVoice and GoContact, are an example. But we've also seen some M&A that struggled, such as Zoom and Five9. It was on and then it was off. And critically, the enterprise channel as well, because many of these providers don't deliver the total solution enterprise needs. They need a local integrator or a local partner to be able to package up the communication needs. So we have Gamma, and we'll be talking about Gamma because they've been making some interesting moves over the last year or so. Also, telcos are channels to market as well. But again, there's a lot of shifts we're seeing, and some of the telcos have been acquiring. Comcast, for example, has been acquiring several companies in the programmable communication space. But hopefully, this gives you a feel for the depth and the breadth of programmable comms. And guess what? Twilio does 99% of a contact center and then has channels deliver it to different types of customers. Its ecosystem delivers a whole range of employee communication solutions. It, of course, has a very broad set of automation technologies. It does in-app communications. It does business messaging, not just SMS and IP messaging, but good old email as well. That's SendGrid. So they cover this whole space. So that's why I use the term programmable comms rather than just CPaaS, because it's just one tiny piece. And of course, this year and last year, the theme, consolidation, partially because of the expansion in as a service for enterprise comms. But with that expansion, what we've seen is many new companies coming onto market, or businesses that are sort of adjacent moving into this space. So even though there's consolidation, there's many more players joining the fight as well, given just the expansion of this market. So now on to CPaaS, or shall I say those that identify as doing more than just messaging. I'm including some old logos here just because it's nice to know that Vonage, well, it bought Nexmo. 8x8 bought Wavecell. Sangoma has built up across VoIP Innovations, Appidays, but also when it bought Star2Star, that had CPaaS capabilities, more UC focused than sort of general CPaaS. But again, capabilities were there. We've seen Cinch buy SAP Digital Interactive, but also buying Intelliquent. So it's being now sort of like the top dog of aggregation for telecom services. And we've seen others raising cash. Microsoft has been very busy in this space. Cineverse got an investment from Twilio and is looking to go IPO. So again, very dynamic sort of situation with lots of different companies. Root Mobile did IPO and has been doing some acquisitions this year. So again, we're going to cover that in the third presentation, but just to show that there's many more players than just Twilio. So it's a bottom-up build. So all the companies that identify their revenues, the growth, we've altered the growth for the pandemic. We've also shifted also some of the percentages for this year as well. So this has been updated, but that is a second order effect, to be honest with you, compared to the shift that we did last year in revenue growth. Then looking at the impact of the pandemic on CPaaS messaging, it depends on your customer mix. It isn't universally, everybody's growing at hundreds of percent. It's more of a mix. Those with more web companies with a role in e-commerce or work from home have seen massive acceleration. And it's not just Twilio. Telesign works with a lot of web companies and has seen impressive growth. If you're more focused on traditional retail or maybe the travel verticals, but again, travel has come back a long way. I mean, there's still gaps like international travel, but you've seen declines and a slow clawback. And even web companies like Airbnb, they've maintained their traffic for a whole variety of reasons. I'm going to share some data on that. General businesses have weathered, but they have declined. Whether it's restaurants, whether it's companies that supply into restaurants, supermarkets have done quite well. But again, they've had supply chain issues and significantly additional costs. So Twilio, Zoom, and a few others have generated some amazing results. Don't get me wrong, but I would say looking broadly across the market, 5% have got 30% or more increase on the pre-pandemic predictions that we had, 30%, like 10% increase on growth, 45 are unchanged, and there's about 20 that have seen a decrease, that have been impacted, particularly for particular regions. So that, we've got to look at it from a regional basis as well. So this shows US travel data. So this is back comparing basically, January this is comparing 2019 to 2020. And you can see we're at about 45% of the traffic in the US. So, people weren't traveling in 2020. Now, what I'm showing here is, again, pre-pandemic, then the pandemic hitting, and then as you can see in 2021, things starting to get back to normal. I mean, this is in April. And then if we look across the data, again, pre-pandemic, pandemic hitting, and then this is through 2021, going up to about October. By June time, it started sort of, it's just about, a 20% gap. So it got to 80%, and then that's it. It sort of stopped. What's going on here? Well, that's international travel. I was down in Orlando for TAC Global in September, and the parks were empty, and because all the kids were in school. What fills up the parks are all the other countries that travel in when the parks are quiet. So, and that's opening up now. And as long as you've got your vaccination certificates, you're good to go. So we will see that rise further over the next couple of months. And I'm sure, into next year, we'll be closed pretty much. A new variant depending, okay? Because the big risk we've got, so the sword of Damocles that's hanging over us is because of the vaccine hesitant, we still have a large population of people that are breeding grounds for new variants, unfortunately. So that's the risk to all the analysis and predictions that we make. So anyway, that's so we understand why it's not had that bigger impact, even on some verticals we would have thought would have been smashed by it. So this is showing the overall market sizing for CPaaS, adding up all the components. It's not just messaging and sort of voice APIs. You've got SIP trunking, you've got IoT, you've got authentication, 2FA, you've got UCaaS, business messaging, contact center. A whole range of stuff is provided by companies that are labeled CPaaS. So this adds it all up and then shows for 2021, well over $10 billion and growing to 25. And it's a nice market to be in. Now, of course, Twilio achieved 132% quarter on quarter. In July of 2020, Zoom had 355% quarter on quarter growth in August 2020. But those exceptions don't make the market. And also, Zoom doesn't get counted in these numbers. It gets counted in employee communication numbers. And when we look at this, core API, it's sort of reaching its peak in terms of compound annual growth rate between 2020 and 2021. The growth, where we're seeing the acceleration, is in all the services. So it's in the higher layers. And that's one of the reasons why Twilio and some of the other CPaaS providers are less focused these days on, the sort of, the basic PSTN aggregation, and far more on, why Twilio bought Segment, focusing on customer data, ensuring the data for your customers is as clean as possible when you do your analytics. And part of the growth also in the programmable comms segment has been significant substitution of telco revenue. So for example, SIP trunking. I mean, Twilio is one of the dominant SIP trunking providers because it's on demand. And the telcos just haven't responded to that. And bundling free services, or should I say, freemium services. So there's a free, then you use it up, and then you start to pay. But at least you get to experiment. Oh, does call recording make sense on our SIP trunks? Then you discover it does, and then you start paying for it. And also enterprise telephony. And I'm going to cover that a little bit later when we look at the M&A, because again, that's a highly dynamic market. And then when we break this down by company HQ, because we can, we're just doing this on a bottom-up build, you can see that Americas dominate, and EMEA and Asia, are so relatively underperforming compared to the North American dominance. Looking at business messaging, so I already mentioned Twilio SendGrid, but in the third presentation I'll give in this review, we've seen, again, many email marketing firms getting bought up, and not just by programmable comms. We're starting to see sort of web-based and enterprise-focused companies buying into this space as well. Again, bottom-up build. I'm not going to waste time. You can look at previous presentations where I've spent more time, and we divide it into companies that are more business focused, and then we add in the total, including CPaaS. So that gives you a figure in total, looking at about 6 billion, growing to 12 billion for business messaging. So again, bottom-up builds, you can segment it any way you want, but for the companies I identified, that's the revenue. What's been interesting when we look at business messaging is there's been a shift targeting enterprises directly rather than working through aggregators. In some regions, what's been happening is some of the aggregators have been buying up companies that were their customers. So there's a sort of consolidation taking place. So as a result, competitors need to react to that. Also, enterprises have significantly more volume now for a lot of their business processes, enough volume so it makes sense to work with some of these messaging providers. So again, this is an interesting shift where direct to enterprise has now more or less equal to the wholesale, and we're seeing faster growth there, simply because, again, the shift to online for many business processes. Then we look at employee communications. You've got UC here, so all the voice stuff, and then all the messaging stuff. Again, this is a small fraction of the providers here, and those that do both. Again, some old logos in here, but as I said, it's always good to see where some of these companies have come from. And also that's included in here is collaboration as well, so because it tends to be dominantly messaging or conferencing biased. Now this shows, again, it's a large established market, but bottom-up analysis gives us about 33 billion by sort of 2021 or so. It's dominated by voice traffic, as you'd imagine. Messaging is a tiny piece of this. It covers alerts, notifications, and SMS come from UC client, but that is so tiny. I just sort of mentioned it to say it is in there, but it's negligible compared to voice. And voice is big. And this is just to say, yes, it's in decline, but even so, 300 billion in mobile. You've got 4 trillion minutes in the US alone. I mean, one of the things that a lot of telcos have seen, mobile in particular, is that the number of minutes used on the phone plans has increased dramatically through the pandemic. People are talking more. There's 100 billion in international voice. That's about 400 billion minutes. And you got 200 billion in fixed and VoIP. So wow, you got 600 billion just there. I mean, people are still talking, and are talking more than they have done because of the pandemic. Now, there is a subtle shift, making it easy to create voice calls from anywhere. So that's the voice API. I mean, enterprises have been asking the telcos for years for a voice API rather than having to use, the traditional network interface. But they've been slow to react to that. But Zoom Phone API is a good example, and that's helped them move into the UC space quite aggressively. And also their conferencing service is available as an API, and they've had a whole host of businesses built on top of that, as well as enterprises building some of their work processes on top of that conference and API. And the business model is very easy. 1 minute, it's 1 cent retail. That's about 75 kilobytes of data, which is about 0.04 cents wholesale. So hey, it's a big, well understood market with 96% margin, and that's one of the reasons why Cinch bought Inteliquent, to give it a big piece of the North American market. Looking at customer communications, far greater growth here. Again, this is bottom up, but you're looking at, for 2021, it's about 18 billion. So that's jiving with other numbers. And as you can see, sort of considerable growth to about 25 billion. Voice API. So this is in there, but again, it's a relatively small piece of it. Those numbers include Twilio Flex, because it offers its platform to integrators. Messaging covers mobile marketing, omni-channel, etc. So again, but it's a small piece. Again, it's just to emphasize, it's the platform cost per seat per month is a dominant piece, as well as, of course, the traditional voice traffic. Now, when we look at contact center as a service landscape, you've got, of course, lots of different players, different sizes. You've got emerging sort of companies that you built on Twilio Flex, but generally you're seeing they're not using. I mean, some are. New Voice Media, of course, got bought by Vonage, but AirCall, as an example, is still built on Twilio. So there are a few examples, but I'd say generally most are just going direct for wholesale interconnect of voice and messaging, because it's where you get it cheapest and you have most control. And on the UCaaS landscape, again, you got some small guys that are using CPaaS, but generally most are just going straight to wholesale interconnect providers. So again, just to give you sort of a little bit more sort of information around the structure of the market. But just to sort of summarize all this data, and I apologize, I have run through this quickly because I'm just highlighting some of the updates. So for 2021, you're looking at across programmable communications, $75 billion market. Here's the growths across the different segments. Some are growing really fast, identity verification being one. I'm going to be talking about that in the last presentation. There's automation tech. Business messaging still has significant growth, particularly because of the pandemic, while some of the other segments are a little bit more sort of traditional because they've been around for many years, and there's some big established players there. But it's important to understand that Twilio and many others do programmable comms. Yes, there's CPaaS, but they're doing business messaging, so SMS, IP, email. They're doing aggregation, they're doing authentication, they're doing SIP trunking, they're doing contact center as a service, they're doing automation tech, IoT, and much, much more. IoT is reselling SIMs. So it's just to emphasize that I use the term programmable comms because CPaaS, it's sort of focusing on just one piece of the business, and it's far broader and more complex than that. Look at it as doing telecoms comms in a web way, and this is changing the market now and into the future, and is on a different trajectory to telcos. So again, I'm going to come back to this a little bit later when we're looking at the future of programmable comms, but this is an important piece to understand, that it's telecoms done in a web way, and it's moving at a very different cadence to the traditional telco market. And just to mention that next year, we're hoping TAD Summit will be in person mid-November in Aveiro, which is, of course, the Venice of Portugal. Thanks to GoContact and Broadvoice for supporting us there. So fingers crossed we don't get a new variant, so that we can actually meet in person. Well, we can look on the positives.